South Africa's unemployment rate stood at 27.7% in the first quarter of 2017. This is the highest unemployment rate since 2003. As many as 48,000 jobs were lost in the 3 months to March 2017. Most of these jobs were in the trade and business service industries. Wide-ranging structural reforms are needed to grow the economy and boost job creation. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development presented a survey together with Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba that identified areas for future action that would aid inclusive growth and job creation. One of these measures is the planned introduction of a national minimum wage, which will reduce in-work poverty and inequality. Labour analyst Andrew Levy joins me in studio for more. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Firstly, why are we seeing such high unemployment numbers?
Well, I think the point needs to be made that this is not something that happens overnight or from last month or the month before. This has been steadily developing over a period of a decade or more. In fact, the data shows 2003. There are also many causes of this, but if one had to look at them, they go from lack of confidence, down rating, lack of foreign direct investment, lack of internal investment, then labour market frictions, which are still there, and sad to say, government inaction. And now we have yet another plan which is going to deal with this, but has already been said it's surprisingly lacking in detail, in actually hard fact, this by then, from where, from how, and unfortunately, no matter what government says, with the institutional, with the labour market and the financial investment community attitudes being what they are, we are left with an abysmally low growth rate, and with that, you don't grow jobs. Now, having said that, just very quickly, it could all change overnight because the infrastructure is still here.
If you had to go to Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba and say your 14-point plan is too vague, this is what I believe you need to do in order to stimulate the economy and especially the labour market and jobs, what would you suggest?
Well, I think the notion of privatisation and restructure of the public sector is vital. But once again, that is a euphemism for efficiency, and that means job losses. And of course, that has a political dimension, and it also has a trade union response. And we've yet to see that government has the stomach for that. I would certainly be saying that, yes, we do need a minimum wage. I don't think that anybody can honestly or indeed sanely argue against it, but I query the level at which it is set. I think it's too high, and I think that it will inevitably lead to certainly job losses in my view, but equally certainly no gains in jobs. And I think there is some wiggle room there. I would rather see people working and then tackle the issue of low wages. I think to some extent, yes, we are a terribly unequal society if you look at the inequality of wealth distribution. But people tend to mistakenly, in my opinion, look at the guy who's the highest earner in the business and the person who's the lowest and say, look at that gap. In reality, anybody in the South African economy who has got a job is privileged. The real gap is between the people who are working and those people who have no possible chance of getting a job. So that's something that we need to look at as well.
People have already said that the national minimum wage proposal is too low. You're saying that you feel like it's too high.
Correct.
What about this thing of working but not actually being able to afford to live, which creates a cycle of poverty and creates the problems that we see?
Yes, I'm certainly not blind to that, and I think that's true. The national minimum wage is being set at about 48% of the median wage in South Africa. That means that nearly 50%, 1 in 2 workers, will be affected by the national minimum wage. Now, there's a balancing act here, and the national minimum wage will be coming out at a level which is probably going to be twice, at least, what many workers earn. Now, I don't think one can make any argument that people who earn 2,500 rand, 2,800 rand a month are anything but in dire poverty. But equally, people who earn 5,000 to 6,000 rand are not well off by any means, but in point of fact, there are at least 25 to 30% of the people who are earning half of that and worse off. And I think that we should be looking at that bit first. And, you know, the other point is that because of the cost implications, the higher paid workers are the ones who are likely to be laid off first because therein lie the greatest savings. So I think there would be room for a far greater national accord on a national minimum wage and a far greater level of consensus around where it should be. You know, by comparison, and of course one can't really make bold comparisons one country to another, the economic structures are different, but most countries don't pitch it at 48%, 28, 29, 30, 35. So we are quite high, and I would simply say the priority now should be to put people to work. Then, when the economy is growing, people are working, then let us tackle the poor and the low wages.
You spoke about the inequality and people looking at the people higher up on the scale. There was a recent newspaper article saying that CEOs of top 100 JCE companies earn 69,000 Rand a day on average. We're seeing those kind of numbers and then seeing the low numbers that you've spoken about. Is there a need to look at how remuneration is structured, or should we just say those people work very hard? We shouldn't look at
I think one's got to go a lot further than that. The first thing I'd say is you've got to be careful of gee whiz statistics. Did you know 50% of all married women are men? Well, that's not necessarily true. But in reality, I doubt very much that the average executive earns 69,000. I would query that. But equally, to say they work very hard, let's forget about them, is not right. Obviously, there are discrepancies in our pay structures, and I would be burrowing much deeper. I would be examining, for example, the gender wage gap, which I think is probably going to be much wider and much more intense. I think unquestionably there is still a racial wage gap. I would be looking at that. So I think we've got to drill a lot deeper. The other thing which one should bear in mind is that a lot of executive pay is driven by results. So it's pay that is at risk. They deliver the results, they get the pay. If they don't, they don't. So there is certainly some kind of argument which says if the organization grows and the executive delivers, well, everyone benefits because jobs are secure and so on and so forth. But all of that aside, I think the argument presented in its most simplistic form hides the complexity, but I certainly think it is something we should be aware of because it's not a South African problem, it's a worldwide problem, it is growing, and that is not a good thing for any society, but I think it ought to be wrapped up in an overall plan which will tackle job creation, gender equality, racial inequality, overall inequality of distribution, and most importantly, the point that you raised, we need to look at what is the level of earnings that will sustain a decent life. Because ultimately, if you're working and you still find yourself on or below the breadline, that is not only a worrying thing for a society, it's something which should sit very heavily on any society's conscience.
Andrew Levy, Labour analyst, thanks so much for your time on SABC News.